is Doug, and man, welcome to the Full Earth Workshop. This is episode 3 of our Dragula build, where we're working on the chassis, we're pulling out the blowtorch, and we're going to create something extremely cool. I did mention on the last episode that we are getting some bona fide decals from the AMT model, and here those are. And now we are ready to start work. Well, as we do on most builds, we're taking it apart and putting it together and then taking it apart again. And that's where we are now. I'm going to pull out the blazer torch, and we've got to disassemble some of the parts on this vintage chassis. We're going to try to maintain as much of this old chassis as possible. One thing I found out is it's actually a lot less expensive to buy a partial build from previous years than to buy the individual parts and put it together. So let's do this disassembly now, which includes a lot of desoldering. Now, if I were an extremely cool person, I would have a desoldering bulb. But instead, we're just going to blow that solder out and knock it out, and you'll see exactly the way we do that. Notice here that I put some tape around the motor because I was using a blowtorch. I didn't want to craze that paint on the motor, but instead it turned out that I could just break it loose with a little wedge, and that has worked really well. Interestingly enough, there was a little piece of wire that was wrapped around with a little solder, which actually worked really well. So now we're going to take off this motor mount section because we have to shorten up this chassis and make a few changes to the pickup section. One thing that is really great about using a torch, it kind of gives you a third hand because you can literally set the torch straight up and then go about your business with both hands there. Of course, being careful not to burn yourself. Okay, I know that looked rather barnyard, but what we're actually doing is blowing out the solder from those holes. Just makes it a lot easier because I don't have a sucking bulb. We're just going to blow the stuff out and knock it out when it gets real hot. And you can see it's pretty clean now, so we're going to go about cleaning the rest of this piece off. And to do that, I'll be using a combination of 4/0 steel wool, known as 0000 steel wool, and some very light sandpaper. You can see it looks almost like new now. We have to have it that way because when we resolder, if you have a lot of this tarnishing, and even the wetness from your hands can affect that solder adhering to the brass. Now, I think this will make it a little bit clearer why I made that sketch in our last episode. I'm going to use this sketch as a one-to-one guide as to how short to cut this chassis. Now, there's a lot of other complicated things to go into this that you will see a little bit later. Using just a little bit of super glue and then fastening it with this kicker, I'm just going to stick it for the time being onto the motor so I can make some good judgments later. Now comes the reassembly, where I take all of these associated parts and we're going to try to figure out the different heights that are required by this build. One of the first things that I do when I start any scratch build is I start to collect a lot of photographs. In this later build of Dragula, you can see the steering rod is in front, whereas on the original Dragula, the steering rod was in back. We're going to try to put it in back like the original was. And remember, we bought this really cool white metal steering assembly, and this is kind of from a tea bucket type of design. So one thing we do notice is that drum brakes were supposed to be on the front. Well, Dragula did not have any brakes on the front. So we've got to take these things away, and that means you have to go boldly forward and start cutting on these really cool parts. And you can see, after sanding, they look like they were meant to be that way. The next thing is offset. The offset of the wheels is going to be way too much. So I need to cut back each one of these so the wheel is very, very close to the turning axis. The little pieces of white metal that I'm cutting off are not wasted. I tend to collect them because later on I can check the hardness of them, because I'm going to try to put in threads, and I want to make sure I've got the proper tools. That includes the drill bit and also the tap, and make sure that it works. You only have one go at this. Luckily, from the Alfa Romeo build, I have lots of metal working tools. This tap, it's for 0.09 bolts, and it works perfectly as an axle for these front wheels. So I'm going to put that in, make sure that the tightness is correct, and then I'm going to hit it with a little bit of super glue just as a thread locker. To hold all these tiny parts together, I'm going to use this extreme power. This is the thick cyanoacrylate, and it works really well on white metal. You just basically cannot remove this after attaching it the first time and hitting it with some kicker. So it is a little bit fiddly. You got to make sure you got the right parts at the right place because, like I said, there's only one go at this. Here I'm using the more runny super glue, and I'm going to use that as a thread locker, as I mentioned. One really good thing to do here that I discovered is make sure you polish up that white metal as you're working here, because later on what I'm going to do is spray it with some clear coat to make sure that that nice finish stays on there, and I won't have to spray it later on to make it look shiny. And that white metal will corrode over time and kind of look dull, so make sure you do that one little step. It's going to save you a headache. Now look at this. That is pretty cool. I kind of think, man, I wonder if I could do an Ackerman steering mechanism on this. I don't know whether I have the room to do it. I'm going to think about that in the next week as I make the next episode. Let me know what you think, though. If you have any good ideas, put it in the comments below. Now, for you guys over in the UK, I wanted to give a big shout out to you because some of the comments I'm getting from the UK are really, really helpful and insightful. So if you got some buddies there that are into this kind of nerdy activity, make sure you get them to sign up here and we can use all the people hanging around the workshop that we can get. Now, I got to admit, I think I need a little bit of work on my nails, man. They're looking really bad. I got a big bruise on my thumbnail there from previous work. Oh, well, deal with me, guys. Well, here it is after the result of today's labor. It's something between cool and very cool. And we got to figure out whether this thing will steer or whether it's just going to be heading straight forward. And I've got to come up with a mounting technique that takes all of these things into consideration. You can see here I'm putting some drilled holes in so I can mount it to the frame, and then we can make those other decisions next week. Please subscribe and like us, and we will see you next week on the Full Earth Workshop.